Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to welcome His Royal Highness Prince Hassan bin Talal.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. May God's peace be upon you all. My opening remarks are to say you've all been too kind and too generous. And I have a very thin tolerance to kindness to me. This is not about me, or with all due respect, and I'm sure both Sol Kanee and Dr. Mauro, President Zatmari would agree, it's about peace and justice. And in the spirit of peace and justice, I think it's only fitting with people suffering and dying in the region where I was born and where I shall die, that we pay tribute to all those who have fallen victims of senseless violence over half a century in the Middle East region, whomsoever they are and wheresoever they come from. And I would like you all to stand for one moment of silent and respectful reflection. Thank you all very much. We've heard a lot about protocol today, but I would like to break with protocol and seek your indulgence in taking my jacket off to get down to business. And the business at hand is to promote the noble art of conversation. I didn't come here to talk at you, but to talk to you. In the words of my friend, Rabbi Friedlander, the start of the millennium for our Christian friends was a date with deep religious connotations. The rest of us work with different calendars, but we live in the same world, yearning for peace and a compassionate society. And I'm here to ask you all, is that task given only to us, whoever that us may be? I think that today we speak of globalization of matter, but need to focus a little bit more on the globalization of the human values that we share. Some years ago, Václav Havel, the President of the Czech Republic, in his New Year address to the nation stated, "The common denominator of the important tasks we should concern ourselves with now is the creation of a genuine, open, and multi-layered civil society." The us, then, is those millions of people in different parts of the world who are not as fortunate as you here in Canada are, who have not been empowered, who are not stakeholders in their present and in their future. I was asked today what I thought was going to happen in the next few months in the context of the strike against Iraq. And I made it very clear that my reading of President Bush's speech yesterday focused on an important statement, war only as a last resort. Now that may be a logical statement, but I do want to say that the question of pluralism, respect for the other, enhancing what is universal and respecting what is different, the question of human dignity, the question of limiting the role of the military and politics in our part of the world, the question of focusing on a landing place, as we called it in the Johannesburg Earth Summit only a few weeks ago, in 2030 and 2050, which is not colored by ethnic and sectarian violence, as we have seen in the Balkans, as our peacekeepers from Jordan, from Canada, have witnessed that palpable hatred that has lasted from generation to generation. The objective then is to know not how wars begin, but how wars end. There is a law of war in the world, and many concessions in law from it. The treatment and protection of refugees is one of them. We spoke for years in the Independent Commission for Humanitarian Issues with the victims of violence, with the mothers of the desaparecidos in Buenos Aires, with the victims of terror, with the stateless, with the dispossessed. And we spoke with them through the NGOs that represented them. And they came and said, can you raise the call for an independent humanitarian order in the General Assembly of the United Nations? And I had a good head of steam behind me. The International Red Cross and nationals of many countries participated in that commission, including Ivan Head, then of the IDRC in Canada. And I went and called for this humanitarian order. We produced over 16 sectoral studies. We produced a book and film matter, a book called Winning the Human Race. But at the end of the day, I had to turn to the NGOs who said to me, we are the lobby for the powerless. I said to him, I know the feeling now. I represent the powerless lobby for the powerless. Petropolitics, hydropolitics, weapons politics. What about anthropolitics? What about politics where people matter? We have always worked against something in our lives. I knew Yehudi Menuhin, had the privilege of speaking to him in the darkest days of the Balkans, when Jews and Muslims were victims in Srebrenica. I was invited last year, or was it 2 years ago now, before the Intifada, to Auschwitz, to Oswiecim. And people in our part of the world said, are you slightly touched in the head? Why are you going? And I said, because if I do not go as moderator of the World Conference on Religions and Peace, the Jews will say, look at that hypocrite, he doesn't attend an interfaith meeting in this context. And I went, and the Catholics said, thank you for triangulating a conversation. The Jews said, thank you for reminding us of the genocide that continues in different parts of the world. Although we don't call it genocide anymore, there are no crimes against peace. And I felt a certain degree of hope in sharing the following statement. I said, the time has come for the Palestinian to internalize the suffering of the Jew, as indeed the time has come for the Jew to internalize the suffering and the anguish of the Palestinian. Of course, this incurred irritation from Arabs and Muslims who said, how can you be speaking in this manner? Bridges of trust have been broken. I said, well, we have to work on rebuilding them. The work of a bridge builder is an extremely lonely task. On the Jewish side, a Jewish girl stood up in New York the other day and said, you talk of suffering, how can you equate the two? I said, I'm not equating them. I'm quoting a member of Knesset, Tony Lapid, the head of the Shinui party, who went further internalize the Holocaust, and internalize the suffering of the Palestinians. But if you're questioning my sincerity, I cannot say any more than I did not come here to score points. I came here to ask you, in the context of the Center for Peace and Justice, the Arthur V. Mauro Center, whether we can develop a civilized framework for disagreement. On a scale of 10, we all have our views on different aspects of life, but do they have to lead to confrontation? I believe that only by accepting responsibility for words and actions at all levels would this ever be possible. I recognize your goal to build bridges between people of all creeds, cultures, and nationalities. I personally am not one of those who believes in a clash of civilizations in the plural. If you read Sumerian, you will recognize that 2,000 years before Christianity, you will find parables such as the book of Job and Jonah and the whale. I was speaking at the Johannes Gutenberg Center the other day, and I said, thank you, Gutenberg, for introducing printing in Amharic, Aramaic, Syriac, Arabic, and Hebrew, which all goes to prove that we have to learn German. One world and 10,000 cultures, one civilization and thousands of cultures have given and taken from this human discourse since the beginning of time. I pay tribute to Dr. Saul Kanee, who devoted his lifetime work to building such bridges between peoples and generations. And I do believe that it's important to remind you to shun the generational divide. In our part of the world, when we go out to dinner, we still sit with our fathers and our grandfathers and our great uncles right down to the youngest. Of course, the youngest get rather bored at 9:30 or 10 o'clock because they want to go and enjoy themselves, and that's all right. But we have not lost hope or given up on the noble art of conversation. I agree with Arthur Mauro when he says that the issue of peace and justice is imperative if we are going to maintain a civilized society. Sometimes I'm paid the backhanded compliment as a bridge builder. In the West, they say, but you are so civilized, which is not a compliment at all. Basically, it means, how can you represent the folks back home because you talk like us? Well, I'm sorry not to conform to a stereotype. And back home, I remember years ago in a mosque, the speaker berating all those who are educated in the West because we are tainted. And I stopped him. And I said, look, there are many more virtuous people than you and I who've studied in the West, who've had the opportunity. Don't be so harsh. And then he, in my view, compounded the sin by saying, oh, I meant them all except for you. We all have to ask ourselves whether we have done justice to what we have inherited from our ancestors, not only in terms of ecology, but above all, wisdom and experience. Ladies and gentlemen, there are many clever people in the world, and I expect increasingly fewer and fewer wise ones. And whether we have done our duty vis-à-vis the future generations, I believe that this process of globalization of values, not just the globalization of policies and economics alone, will tell as to whether future generations will understand the issues, will understand the importance of an ethic of human solidarity. In the events of September 11th, we have seen a gradual trend towards the introduction of a new world order. And I came here to talk about a culture of participation. In Mainz in Germany a few weeks ago, I attended the International Middle East Center's Congress, 2,000 participants, think tanks, universities from all over the world, studying our part of the world. 60 Israelis, Iranians, Turks, Libyans, Egyptians, Western Hemisphere, Americans, Canadians, and so forth, in an atmosphere of academic objectivity. It is these people expressing their respective views whom we need to act as the script writers for the media. And I'm not just talking about the visual media, not talking about what your Manitoban alumnus, Marshall McLuhan, referred to as the media is the massage. But I'm talking about the message substantively of teleconferencing, of citizens conferencing, of opening up conversations which you have the objectivity and the relative remoteness to do on behalf of us all and before it is too late. You can help humanize this conversation. And I would just like to suggest that the conference I attended, entitled The Culture of Peace, which I hosted in Aqaba after it had traveled from Rhodes, Jerusalem to Aqaba, with several speakers commenting on a historical political event, the peace treaty signed between Jordan and Israel in 1994, that when asked what I thought of that peace treaty, at that very moment, something for which I had worked for many years, I said in front of the visual media, late Prime Minister Rabin and my late brother were on the podium, this can only succeed, and I did not mean to be prophetic at all, but on record, I said, if this peace is between people. Peace is not between talking heads. Peace and the culture of participation means that we are all stakeholders. I know that we have far-sighted leadership and visionaries who often pay the price, physically lay down their life for the cause of peace. But I would like to suggest that it is much more relevant to build step by step from the bottom up with the participation of your civil society, your NGOs, your academia, and not just leave the credit of achieving peace to publicized ceremonies between heads of state and government, shaking hands and exchanging those awfully sincere smiles. I recently had the privilege of initiating, alongside many American non-governmental organizations, a call for a program, which you might have read about in the Herald Tribune a couple of weeks ago, of Partners in Humanity. I took the theme from Partners in Development, Lester Pearson. And I said, why can we not develop an interactive conversation? I don't want to be studied by centers of excellence in the West as though I was some kind of a laboratory specimen. I would like to develop a conversation on the basis of you're hearing what I have to say. I remember Bill Clinton was off to an OECD summit some years ago in Denver, and I was off to Beaver Creek to an AAI meeting. And he said, what do you think will come out of this? What can we do? And I said, when you speak to the Sherpas or the shepherds, just remember the sheep. The interaction, the Sherpas and the shepherds are the people who write the brief, as we know, for heads of government and heads of state. The interactive process of conversation should not only be a formal process. I am proud to be the patron of the Fulbright program in our part of the world. I am happy to receive endless numbers of young people through the Peace Corps program, but I have called for the creation of an international, non-denominational Peace Corps, so that young people can give of themselves. Someone once said, why don't we move from blue helmets to blue overalls? What about doing good things in bad times? Isn't that a challenge worthy of our youth? Can we move from acquisitiveness, everything is mine, 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 to altruism, to caring for the other? Because if we don't, we can talk as much as we want about globalization and global village, but in fact, this globalization is a new form of tribalism, of the rich and the poor, of the young and the old, of the North and the South. And I think the sharing of values means doing something for others. I remember working with Aleppo Connolly in Western Sudan some years ago. We created a charity called the Hashemite Charitable Association. We took some of our finest doctors who receive a very fine fee, and they spent 6 months working in basic conditions. They said this experience created a value change in all of us. Secondly, I'd like to mention that the Parliament of Cultures has now finally been ratified. We hope to see it engaging in Istanbul in Turkey. Why did we choose Istanbul? Because it's not a capital city, it's not an Asian or European city, it's a crossroads. And my hope is that we can see 25 participants from the Western Hemisphere, including Japan, and 25 participants from our part of the world, emphasizing the link between the scriptwriters and the media. The group that worked on the dialogue of civilizations, as called for by the Secretary General of the United Nations in the 1990s, spoke of the indignities of the 1990s. I just wonder whether we are going to sit by and allow those indignities to continue through the 21st century. I am reminded of the attacks of last year were perhaps the greatest manifestation of those indignities. I don't have to go around reminding you that hundreds of Muslims lost their life in 9/11. What a gross indignity to almost 2 billion Muslims that inhabit our fragile planet. Long before these terrorists hijacked the planes that crashed into New York and Washington, I have believed firmly that we need an enlightened, centrist platform based on inclusion, where men and women of goodwill share in their common humanity. I was asked the other day on Jazeera television what my judgment was of Osama bin Laden. I said, judgment is God's. I don't expect him to judge me or me to judge him. But I do feel that there is a need for legitimating a conversation that gives religion the moral authority it seems to have set aside. We cannot turn men of religion into politicians and hope to build a better world. A year on from these terrible, tragic events, the human family has endured further indignities. The murder of civilians in the Palestinian territories, suicide bombings in Israel, the systematic slaughter of men, women, and children in the Indian city of Gujarat, nuclear brinkmanship in one of the world's poorest regions, from Israel to India. My wife was born in Calcutta, and I am perfectly aware of the mosaic of nationalities and ethnicities that this fragile region represents. It is an orphan region. Sometimes Muslims feel that the world ignores the facts. 70% of the world's refugees are Muslim, and they are referred to as extremists. There are reasons for that extremism. including our own government's mismanagement of our own lives. I don't say this as a reformed sinner, having exercised public office for many, many years. You will recognize that there is a certain boring consistency in everything that I have said if you go back to that website. The American ambassador recently suggested that the greatest challenge to America's commitment, courage, and creativity lies not in enforcing stability through military might, which can never succeed in the long run, but in building security through foreign policies that address the political roots of terrorism. Since 9/11, every single government has emphasized the importance of security, security, security. They say anyone who disagrees with me is a disagreeable person. And this is the tragedy, that they do not recognize the importance of soft security, developing a conversation, developing dialogue, reaching out to the other. My late brother, King Hussein, said in 1996 in Sharm el-Sheikh, it is vital that terrorism is tackled at the international level. How can you do this with generations of hatred? Let me refer you to the educational syllabus of Europe, in post-war Europe. I studied French history from an English point of view. And I remember the Frenchman who came to London and said, funny people, these English, look at all those statues, Trafalgar, Waterloo, all French victories. I'm glad you're not all asleep. I recognized in Europe the Erasmus program, the Socrates program, the Tempus program. I don't know what you do for history and education in Canada, but teaching by analogy is extremely important. Putting yourself in the shoes of the other. If you have priorities, then you have to recognize the priorities of the other. We in Jordan welcomed the development of the Human Security Center, which Lloyd Axworthy pioneered. And I'm glad to remember the link between the humanitarian order and the Human Security Center. But I have to say once again that human security is an issue relating to people's minds and hearts. Do you know the longest distance in the world? Well, let me tell you, it's here, between this and this. And bridging it is not an easy exercise. An Arab the other day was stopped at a passport control on the way into the United States, and they said to him, are you carrying a weapon? And he said, yes. Where, they asked. He said, here. Not interested in that. So I would just like to emphasize the importance of the social threat that we face. I'm a member of NTI, Nuclear Threat Initiative. NTI has been enormously successful in dismantling 40% of the arsenal of the former Soviet Union. One warhead of chemical or biological would destroy 100,000 civilians or more. And we're deeply distressed with the possibility of the use of the dirty bomb and the suitcase bomb. But I am also equally distressed by the fact that in our region there is no social threat initiative. Extremism is not just the creation of yesterday, it is the result of the amalgam of iniquities to which the individual is subjected. I cite the director in Herzliya, Israel, Boaz Ganor's statement on terrorism. Terrorism, he says, should not be an act understood as an act of cultural relativism, which in plain English means that in Northern Ireland I received an honorary degree from a Jewish chancellor in a non-denominational university, or a multi-denominational university rather, and a Muslim recipient. Over lunch they asked me, what about Islamic terror? I said, pardon, may I ask you in Northern Ireland, do you have Christian terror? They said, you have a point. The time has come to recognize that living on $1 a day is a form of terror. The time has come to recognize that we as Muslims have to develop an international benevolent fund, and I have called for years for an international zakat fund, sadaqat fund. 9/11 closed down zakat, and I said we need an alternative. It is a pillar of faith, well managed through, for example, the Islamic Development Bank, transparent, guaranteed by governments. And as I remember during the Troy Hunt experience, the corporation that was responsible for rebuilding East Germany and the Eastern European communities, where I also work as president of the Club of Rome through EEE, European Environmental Education, pension funds had a stirring of conscience. They said, we are prepared to work through an international bank such as the European Investment Bank, provided it is done clearly, transparently, and efficiently, and focused on the needs of the poor. I was sitting at an economic forum meeting, and one of the Dutch corporate presidents looked at 9 of us, Prime Minister of Mauritius, member of the Russian Duma, different nationalities, and he said, if I come to any of your countries, I will not expect a bribe, nor will I give one. I said, well, if you adopted this approach, transparent, guaranteed by government, you wouldn't have to either expect a bribe or give one. In 1994, at the Casablanca summit of the Middle East and North African nations, we called for $35 billion of investment in infrastructure, clean drinking water, roads, from Morocco to Turkey inclusive. We went to the European Union. Shimon Peres was then in office, and we said, are you going to put together a concept group to talk about a community of water and energy in the way Europe started as a concept of coal and steel, an extraterritorial concept? The answer was first come, first serve. Purely commercial. My friends, Arabs, Muslims, Jews, and Christians traded peacefully from the Atlantic Moroccan coast all the way to the coast of Malabar in India for 6 centuries. And then Vasco da Gama arrived one day, and he said to the Jain king, and the Jains are Pacific by belief, expel those traders or I will kill you. And the Jain king came back with one question: what is kill? Can you imagine? In the decade that we could have spent $35 billion on encouraging the will to stay for refugees and migrants, over $300 billion have been spent on purchasing weapons. I was talking to an American legislator the other day, and he said to me, folks like you are bad for business. Well, I've never done business, so I suppose I really wouldn't understand. I don't want to take too much of your time, but please remember one thing. When looking at the Middle East, West Asian region, remember that we are only a region in name. When I speak of South Asia and West Asia, I think it's important to bear in mind that in reality we're also talking of North Africa, the Moroccan, North African coast, down to the Congo, Sudan, the Red Sea, the south of the Arabian Sea, and all the way up to the top of the energy ellipse. 70% of the world's oil and the world's gas. My concern is for who is going to live in that part of the world, and what hope do they have? The Human Development Report of the United Nations Development Programme says that people's lives are being linked more deeply, intensely, and immediately than ever before as distance, time, and borders diminish. I'd be delighted to hear that arms sales too have diminished, and in the Middle East had been cut in order to fund educational schemes. in the Arab world, or that 1.2 billion Muslims struggling against scarce resources, economic barriers, immigration and emigration controls, religious discrimination, international criticisms, and often their own governments have been cordially invited to contribute their ideas of what would constitute a good world civilization for all. I thank you for having given me this opportunity to talk of developing a global ethic, a terra media, a middle ground. I hope that we can bear in mind the words of one regional politician the other day who said, "How can we trust each other? It's not a question of light at the end of the tunnel. We've lost the tunnel." And when speaking about the end game in the Middle East and whether or not or how we can trust each other, I think it's important to bear in mind that even in these difficult times, you referred to the Hebrew University, and I'd like to refer to Yaakov Bar Siman Tov, the director of the Leonard Davis Institute of International Relations, who has posed the problematic of peacemaking and offered a resolutique. Basically, our argument, all of us, is only stable peace and reconciliation guarantee warm and positive peace, stability and durability of peace relations. So the questions are, what is stable peace? Why and how does stable peace emerge? What are the conditions for maintaining stable peace over time? And I would like to suggest that going back to peace and justice, one has to understand the Israeli requirement for security and the Palestinian requirement for justice. One has to understand the importance of intra-independence. When I was talking in Los Angeles in the 70s, I mentioned the Benelux model. And Abba Ivan was in the audience. And someone asked me, what about Benelux? I said, ask the author of Benelux. Does he accept 3 sovereignties? Not interdependence. Interdependence can mean crumbs from your table. But intra-independence. The recognition of the fact that you too have an identity. Melting pots don't just melt. And I think that is something that should be borne in mind any more than the flaws in the theory that mutual knowledge cures all. I'd just like to remind you that it is not true that if you know the other, you necessarily love him anymore. Let me give you some examples of confrontation among co-religionists and co-nationalists. In the Caucasus, for instance, Christian Russia backed Muslim Abkhazia against Christian Georgia. Muslim Abkhazia against Christian Georgia, while Muslim Iran played off Christian Armenia against Muslim Azerbaijan. Tell me that has something to do with principles or with the love of humanity. The list continues. Ossetians against Georgians, both Christian. Lezgins against Azeris, both Muslim. Circassians against Karachay, both Muslims. And elsewhere in Lebanon, savage battles raged between Muslims, Christians, and Druze, all of whom knew each other sufficiently well already. But the most savage of all battles often took place within each sect. In the Balkans too, where for each conflict involving co-religionists, for instance, Moldovans versus Russians, Hungarians versus Romanians, Macedonians versus Greeks, Serbs versus Croats. Familiarity doesn't always eradicate enmity. Sometimes they say it breeds contempt. But I would like to go back to the basic dilemma, to recognize our region as a region. Mesopotamia, before the last strike on Iraq in 1990, I received letters from archaeologists. They read, "Remember the debt we owe Mesopotamia." During the siege of the Church of the Nativity the other day, I was asked if I would go, and I said, by all means. And I had to deliver a message because I was not allowed in. And the message basically was, where is love thy neighbor? Where is the sanctity of human life? Where are the 10 commandments, thou shalt not kill? We say we live in a civilized world, but I derive hope at the end of these remarks from the words of Jalal ad-Din al-Rumi, one of the greatest poets of the Islamic world, born in Afghanistan in the 13th century, who said, "Come now, whoever you are. Come without any fear of being disliked. Come whether you are a Muslim, a Christian, or a Jew. Come whoever you are, whether you believe or do not believe in God." This is the 13th century. Come also if you believe in the Son as God. This door is not a door of fear. This is a door of good wishes. And it is with those good wishes that I love you and leave you. Thank you. Wassalamu alaikum.